let's explain the science behind persistent spike syndromes and dive right into the 3X biotics framework. You know, the pandemic really brought a whole lot of things to light. But honestly, one of the biggest medical realizations was that the biological effects of exposure to the virus, SARS-CoV-2, well, they aren't always just limited to that initial acute phase of getting sick. For a huge percentage of people out there, a cascade of really complex biological processes gets triggered, and that leads to systemic challenges that can stick around for months or literally even years. So today, we're going to unpack the biological pillars of these persistent spike syndromes, and we'll take a close look at this fascinating nutritional framework of supernutrients, known as 3X biotics, that's designed to support your body's cellular resilience.
Okay, let's dive into this. First up, we'll look at the persistent spike mystery. Then we'll explore immunity, iron, and energy. Third is blood vessels and the brain. Fourth, gut health and metabolism. And finally, we'll tie it all together with the 3 biotics framework. So, why do symptoms persist months or even years after exposure? It's a massive question, right? Normally, with the typical virus, you get sick, your body clears it, and you recover. Boom, done. But with these persistent syndromes, researchers are finding that actual fragments of the virus, specifically the spike protein, can just hang out and remain in certain tissues. It's not just one single mechanism causing all the trouble. It's more like a giant web, a complex interaction of multiple biological processes that just keep feeding into each other over and over. Now, we're seeing this phenomenon mostly in 2 specific contexts. The most common one for sure is long COVID, which scientists call PASC. But the scientific literature has also documented some rare cases of persistent symptoms showing up after vaccination, sometimes called PAC-VS. Now, we want to be super objective here. The frequency and severity of post-vaccination symptoms are vastly lower compared to long COVID. However, the studies do suggest they actually share common biological pathways. In both scenarios, the underlying driver is exposure to that spike protein and the persistent immune response that follows. Basically, these are physiological systems under siege. Section 1, immunity, iron, and energy. Let's zoom way into the cellular level. All right, one of the absolute most fascinating recent discoveries is the link between the spike protein and a process called ferroptosis. The best way to think about ferroptosis is basically like cellular rusting. It's a specific type of cell death that happens when reactive iron just builds up and accumulates inside the cell, causing massive oxidative stress. And this literal rusting is heavily implicated in the lung, vascular, neurological, and metabolic damage we're seeing in long COVID. Now, what's really interesting about this is the cascading effect of the cellular damage. It's a total domino effect. First off, you've got these persistent spike antigens constantly keeping your immune system on high alert, just pumping out inflammatory cytokines like IL-6. And this chronic stress can actually wake up dormant, latent viruses that are already hanging out in your body, like Epstein-Barr, which just exhausts your system even more. Meanwhile, that reactive iron we just talked about, it's still accumulating, driving that ferroptosis. And as a result of all this chaos, your mitochondria, the actual power plants of your cells, they get damaged. They literally stop producing ATP, which is pure cellular energy. And that right there is what leads to that crushing, persistent fatigue so many people are experiencing. And this is exactly where nutritional science steps in. The 3X biotics framework brings in specific supernutrients to help intervene. For instance, compounds like spermidine and lactoferrin are brilliant because they physically bind to that reactive iron. They help control iron homeostasis and basically stop that cellular rusting in its tracks. Then you have spermidine. Spermidine is incredible because it supports a process called mitophagy. Think of mitophagy like taking out the cellular trash. It actually helps the cell recycle damaged mitochondria and clear out altered proteins. Finally, you've got postbiotics and polyphenols stepping in to help balance the immune system and support the return of normal ATP energy metabolism. Section 2, blood vessels and brain. Let's move out of the microscopic cell and into the vascular and neural systems. Have you ever wondered why someone dealing with what started as a respiratory-based syndrome suddenly develops dizzy spells, a racing heart, or just terrible brain fog? Well, it usually comes down to dysautonomia. This is a breakdown in the autonomic nervous system. That's the system running all your critical background processes, like your heart rate and digestion. Basically, the vital communication lines between your nerves, your immune system, and your blood vessels get completely scrambled. So the crucial point here is that the spike protein can directly attack the vascular endothelium. That is the delicate, super important lining of your blood vessels. When this lining gets damaged, it reduces nitric oxide, which leads to microinflammation and even microclots. This literally means your tissues aren't getting enough oxygen and blood flow, a state known as hypoperfusion. And when this happens in the brain, it triggers neuroinflammation, leading to really devastating day-to-day symptoms. We're talking brain fog, severe memory issues, headaches, and conditions like POTS, where simply standing up from a chair causes your heart rate to just skyrocket. To combat all of this, your body desperately needs a balanced biological environment so it can start to heal. Specific compounds within the 3X Biotics framework, like polyphenols, flavonoids, and fermentative metabolites, they act like shields. They step in by reducing oxidative stress specifically within those blood vessels. This supports endothelial function and helps to resolve that neuroinflammation we just mentioned, which ultimately creates a much more favorable environment for proper neuronal function and neuroplasticity.
Section 3. Gut health and metabolism. Let's look at the body's metabolic engine. Central to this whole structural pillar is dysbiosis. This happens when the good and bad bacteria in your gut fall completely out of balance. But we're not just talking about an upset stomach here. It leads to increased intestinal permeability, which you've probably heard called a leaky gut. When your gut barrier is compromised like this, bacterial toxins, called endotoxins, literally leak out into your bloodstream. And that triggers massive, system-wide inflammatory alarms. And this leaky gut just creates another massive domino effect. It activates your mast cells, which leads to histamine intolerance. That's why suddenly you might find yourself reacting badly to foods you used to eat without any issue at all. Plus, that endotoxemia amplifies all the multi-systemic symptoms we've already covered today. But it also deeply impacts your metabolism. We start seeing insulin resistance, altered lipid metabolism, and a heavily disrupted cortisol axis. To put it simply, your body's metabolic resilience drops, effectively leading to accelerated biological aging. Nobody wants that. But it is absolutely fascinating to see how specific nutrients can target these exact metabolic dysfunctions. Short-chain fatty acids, or SCFAs, along with bioactive peptides, they work to quite literally seal up that leaky gut and restore barrier integrity. Then you have immunoglobulins, which help regulate the communication between your gut bacteria and your immune system. But perhaps the most exciting part, especially for longevity, are spermidine and specific fatty acids like C15O and C17O. These actually support deep anti-aging mechanisms, including NAD+ metabolism and the expression of the clotho-protein. And if you follow longevity science, you know the clotho-protein is highly associated with healthy aging. Section 4. The 3 Biotics framework. Let's take a macro view of the whole thing. And looking at the composition of this framework brilliantly illustrates exactly what we're talking about. The sheer diversity of the 3 Biotics formula is really the key here. It is definitely not just one single magic ingredient. It's more like a symphony of compounds, polyamines, postbiotics, polyphenols, and bioactive peptides, all designed to address multiple physiological failures simultaneously. When you combine them, these ingredients work systemically to support the core physiological targets your body actually requires for recovery. They promote cellular recycling through autophagy. They stop that cellular rusting by controlling oxidative stress and keeping iron levels in check. They boost mitochondrial efficiency to help restore your energy. They patch up the intestinal barrier. And ultimately, they help bring your immune and metabolic systems right back into a healthy state of balance. Now, it is absolutely vital to be very clear about what the science concludes here. 3X Biotics is a powerful nutritional framework designed to support natural cellular homeostasis and physiological processes. It is explicitly not a medical treatment or a cure for long COVID or post-vaccination syndromes. Its role is strictly to provide the biological tools your body needs to support its own incredibly complex recovery mechanisms. Which leaves us with a really profound thought to ponder. We've seen how a microscopic protein can trigger a massive systemic siege on the entire body. But we've also seen how targeted, deep cellular nutrition can empower the body's natural defense and recycling systems. So, if we start viewing our health through the lens of cellular resilience, rather than just symptom management, how might that completely reshape our approach, not just to recovery, but to long-term health, vitality, and longevity? Thank you so much for joining this explainer today. Keep asking questions and keep exploring the science.